At this time, I'd like to introduce our first presenter. Rebecca Peterson is a Product Marketing Manager for System Sensor. Rebecca, take it away.
Thank you, David. Well, first I want to thank everyone for taking time out of your busy days to attend this webinar. The low frequency requirement is new and an important code that went into effect January 1st of 2014 and has impacted the sleeping space requirements within NFPA 72. While the tone is not that dramatic, the changes to the design of the products as well as the systems and the enforcement has been. These changes have impacted states and regions that are following the 2010 or the 2013 edition of NFPA 72. And coming January 1st of 2015, it will also impact those that follow the 2012 edition of NFPA 720. As David mentioned, over the next 45 minutes, we will be giving you as much information to prepare you for the low frequency requirements, as well as provide you with an overview of our product solutions. I will start by going over the codes and the sections impacted by the low frequency requirements for both NFPA 72 and NFPA 720. Then I will go over the UL requirements for the listing of the low frequency devices. Then I'm going to turn this over to Chris Cahill, who will go over the product offerings and then address some design considerations and system applications. As David mentioned, if you have any questions that you feel we have not answered, please feel free to enter them into that chat box. To the left, you will see the agenda throughout the entire presentation so you can see where we're at. We have a lot of information to cover, so let's get started. So first, let's go over the NFPA requirements related to low frequency. As a reminder, the low frequency requirements are reflected in 3 chapters of NFPA 72, the 2010 and the 2013 edition. The first chapter impacted is Chapter 18, which is the chapter for protected premise fire alarm systems. So these are the systems that are primarily used in commercial applications. The requirements for the sleeping spaces are referenced in Section 18.4.5, and the requirement was introduced into Section 18.4.5.3 that states that if you're required to put a notification appliance into a sleeping space, it has to be able to produce its alarm signal at a lower frequency. Specifically, it's got to be centered around 520 Hz, and it has to be of a square wave format. It's important to note that in the 2013 edition, the verbiage was modified slightly to make it clear that this tone is only required for the sleeping spaces. There was some confusion that the low frequency tone would be required throughout the entire building. And we've done a previous webinar where we talked about the origination of this tone. And really the tone is intended to be a better means for awakening individuals, including those that have mild to severe hearing loss. So the low frequency tone is only intended in the sleeping spaces. The next chapter is Chapter 24, which addresses emergency communication systems, such as an in-building emergency alarm communication system and mass notification systems. What they're really talking about is voice systems in this case. And what it's saying is that if you have to put a speaker into a sleeping space, then that pre-alert tone, which is that tone that you play before you go into your voice message, has to have a component of the low frequency 520 Hz square wave tone. All they're really trying to say is, you want to make sure that you're going to awaken those individuals before you tell them what they're supposed to do in case of an emergency. It's important to note that in the UL 864 9th edition standard, so that's a standard that all of the control panels are listed to, it actually gives you an indication of how long you should play this message. And what they want you to do is play the tone, which can be individual or it can be combined with a voice message. It can be in duration of 3 to 10 seconds, and they want you to cycle this about 3 times to make sure that the occupants have heard the tone and the message. Now, in the 2013 edition of NFPA 72, first of all, they moved the entire section to 24.4.2.4.2. And one of the things that was a little confusing in the 2010 edition, and let me just go back for a second, is that it just mentioned the fact that it has to have this low frequency component, 520 Hz square wave range. And people didn't like how loose those terms were. So what they wanted to do is make it clear that now they're referring you back to Section 18.4.5, which means that the requirement goes into effect January 1st of 2014. The signal has to be centered around 520 Hz, and it has to be of a square wave format. They also added another little provision in there that states that this is only intended to awaken individuals, once again, to try to bring you back to the study. The last chapter, oh, sorry, this is a duplicate slide. The last chapter in the 2010 edition that was impacted is Chapter 29. Now, Chapter 29 addresses occupancies that are required to install smoke alarms for single and multiple station household fire alarm systems. Now, this chapter took a different stance, and they're only requiring the low-frequency alarm signal in sleeping spaces where you have some sort of a law or a code, or if an individual chooses to provide a means for occupants that have declared themselves as having some sort of mild to severe hearing loss. They deferred a little different from Chapter 18, where they're required to put that low-frequency alarm signal in every sleeping space. In the 2013 edition of NFPA 72, once again, the verbiage was modified slightly just to make it clear that these devices are only intended to awaken sleeping individuals. Now, there are also low-frequency requirements within the 2012 edition of NFPA 720. Now, this is the standard for the installation of carbon monoxide detection and warning equipment. There are two chapters that were impacted, Chapter 6 and Chapter 9. Now, Chapter 6 addresses carbon monoxide detectors connected to a protected premise fire alarm system or a dedicated carbon monoxide system. Now, I want to make it clear that the requirements in Chapter 6 do not cover the audible alarm signals produced by a carbon monoxide alarm. So those would be the ones that you find in your residential homes, the ones that you can pick up at Home Depot or Menards. This is very similar to what's addressed in Section 18.4.5 of the 2010 edition of NFPA 72, where it states that if you're required to put an audible notification appliance in a sleeping room, that the device has to be able to produce its alarm signal at a lower frequency centered around 520 Hertz, and it has to be of a square wave format. And as you could see at the bottom here, and I'm going to use this little highlighter tool, they refer you back to NFPA 72 so that it's clear that the studies are aligned. Now, it's important to note that carbon monoxide detectors, carbon monoxide alarms, they have to produce a different temporal pattern. So they require a temporal 4, where smoke detectors and smoke alarms require a temporal 3. But the actual alarm tone, the frequency is the same of that lower frequency pattern. Chapter 9 is another chapter that was impacted, and this covers all the occupancies that are required to install a carbon monoxide alarm. So these would be your, carbon monoxide alarms that you find in your homes that you would pick up at Menards. This chapter aligned very closely to Chapter 29, where they're only requiring that low-frequency alarm signal if you're required by some sort of a law or a code, or if you choose to provide a means for individuals that have mild to severe hearing loss. The compliance date is the same as Chapter 6, and I think I forgot to mention that previously, is that the compliance for the NFPA 720 is January 1st of 2015. And the difference in the date is just because NFPA 720 and NFPA 72 are in different code revision cycles, so they're just a year behind. Okay, now let's focus on the UL requirements for low-frequency notification appliances. Now, I'm primarily going to focus on the ANSI UL 464 standard. So this is the standard for audible signaling appliances. So this is a standard that all of our mini horns, sounder bases are listed to. And the reason why I'm focusing on this standard in particular is because this is the only standard that allows for a general evacuation tone if it's listed for a public mode listing, meaning that most of the other standards that have, let's say for the smoke alarms or smoke detectors or carbon monoxide alarms that have some sort of an audible component, those are normally listed for just a local notification. So you're not allowed to trigger a general evacuation based on that device. Only if those devices are listed to ANSI UL 464 can you do that. So what they did is they added Section 24.3 to define the performance requirements for low-frequency devices. Now, I have the date noted here, which was April of 2012 for a reason. The first time that the low-frequency requirement information was published was in 2009, was when they released the 2010 edition of NFPA 72. It took UL approximately 3 years to develop their performance requirements as well as their test equipment to evaluate and list products as low-frequency devices. So what they added was, we're going to focus on section 24.3.2. And what they're looking at is the harmonic profile of these devices. Now, you all pretty much did some analysis and determined that the majority of manufacturers were going to be using some sort of a speaker element to meet this requirement. And so they wanted to look at the odd harmonics of this signal. And the importance of the odd harmonic is because this is really what defines that square wave tone, which aligns with the study and aligns with what's in NFPA 72 and NFPA 720. So what they're going to do is take that signal and they're going to look at the odd harmonic. So the first harmonic has to be centered around that 520 hertz. Then they're going to focus on the third harmonic, which has to be centered around 1560. Then they're going to look at the fifth harmonic, which has to be centered around 2600 hertz. And then they're going to look at the seventh harmonic, and it has to be centered around 3640. They're going to do all of this using a fast Fourier transform, which is just a mathematical algorithm. Now, what they're doing is they're taking a 30-second sampling using a spectrum analysis, and they're looking at a range of this frequency. And when they're looking at these frequency bands, what they're looking is at the audibility. So they want to make sure that that first frequency has its highest dB output peak. Then they're going to look at that third harmonic, and they want to make sure that it's at least 5 dB less than the highest peak of that first harmonic, but no less than 20 dB from that highest peak. Then they're going to go to the fifth harmonic, and they're going to make sure it's at least 5 dB from the highest peak of F1, but not less than 30 dB. And they're going to go to the last harmonic, and they want to make sure it's at least 5 dB from that highest peak of F1, but not less than 50 dB of F1. Now, this is a very specific profile that they're looking at, and it's not something that's easy to develop. And that's one of the reasons why it has taken a lot of us manufacturers time to come out with a lot of these low-frequency solutions. Now, I'm trying to make this a little bit easier for you to understand, so I have this graphical model. Now, what this is actually a snapshot of our low-frequency signal from our AV product line. So what they did is they took that first harmonic profile and they looked at that frequency response, and they made sure it was centered around 520 hertz. And then they took that highest dB peak. Then they go to the third one, and they're just making sure that it's within this dB band, meaning that it's got to be less than 5 dB of that highest peak, but not less than 20. Then they go to the fifth one. It's got to be centered around 2600 hertz, and it's got to be between this wider dB band. And then the seventh one, the band gets even wider. Now, on top of all of the other performance requirements, this is a very specific requirement just for products that want to be listed as low-frequency products. So you still have to meet audibility, you still have to meet corrosion, impact test, and a number of other tests. But something else that they added to the standard was a marking requirement. Since they knew that a lot of the manufacturers were going to be using very similar housing designs, they wanted to make it clear to either a fire marshal or an individual that's in that occupancy space to know what's the difference between a low-frequency device and a non-low-frequency device. So in Section 39 of ANSI 464, they added this marking requirement that says that the device has to have a permanent marking that is visible on the housing that says either low-frequency alarm or low-frequency sounder. I've also seen products that are out there now that say just like 520 hertz. So UL's in essence being very accommodating with this marking requirement. They just want to make sure that manufacturers are putting something on the housing so you can easily distinguish the products. Now, I do want to make you aware that there are also performance requirements in a number of other standards. ANSI UL 217 is the standard for smoke alarms. ANSI 268 is a standard for smoke detectors. ANSI UL 2034 is a standard for carbon monoxide alarms. And lastly, ANSI 2075 is the standard for carbon monoxide detectors. As I mentioned before, all of these standards, if they do have an audible tone component, they can only be used as a local notification, so you can't use it for evacuation. So if any of these products wanted to be used for evacuation, they would have to have a complementary listing to ANSI UL 464. Now, one of the questions that I have received since we've launched our product is, how do I distinguish whether a product meets the low frequency requirements or not? Since there are products that have been out in the market space for a number of years that have wide frequency ranges. I've been pointing out the dates of these standards and of the code for a reason. So as I mentioned before, NFPA 72, the first time the low frequency requirements were published was in 2009. The UL standards were all released in April of 2012. So what that means is that if there was any products that were available in the market that you would think produced their tone at these lower frequency ranges, it would mean that a manufacturer would have to go back to UL and have those products evaluated to the new low frequency performance requirements that are in any of these product standards. So this is a way that UL is making sure that products comply with the new low frequency requirements. But another way that you can tell is you can look at the online certifications listing card. This is a snapshot of our AV listing card. So you can see specifically it says 520 Hz low frequency sounders and sounder strobes. As more and more manufacturers come out with products, you're going to start to see very similar things in their listing cards. And I've noticed in a lot of the product manuals, you'll see things that say complies with the new low frequency sleeping space requirements so that you know which products are intended to meet the code. Okay, David, I think it's time for our first poll question.
All right, Rebecca, thank you very much. It is time for the poll question, the first poll question. And we'll also answer a couple of questions that have been submitted. So let's review the poll question here briefly. When will you be required to meet the low frequency requirements? We've walked through the 2010 and 2013 code requirements and also those that are part of NFPA 720. So could you go ahead and indicate if you're currently, perhaps you're in a jurisdiction that is already having to meet the requirements. Maybe that's why you're here, to make sure you understand them correctly. Maybe within the next 6 months or the next 7 to 12 months, the next year and a half basically. More than a year and a half out, you don't know, or maybe never. Maybe you're in a jurisdiction that is not ever going to comply, perhaps. So if you could go ahead and indicate that. Rebecca, we do have a couple questions posted here. In fact, we've got this one a couple times. Are the low-frequency sounders required for retrofit applications?
That's a great question. So the intent of the code as well as the building code was meant for any new construction. But of course, there are always situations where if you have a retrofit application where you're doing a massive teardown, the authority having jurisdiction does have the discretion to require you to bring that whole building up to the latest code. So I would strongly suggest that you consult with your AHJ whether that project is going to have to comply with the new low frequency requirements.
Yeah, when in doubt, always check with your AHJ. I think that's something we say on almost every webinar. Folks, you're starting to see the results populated here. We have nearly 600 people on with us today, so we're getting a good broad base of coverage. Rebecca, it looks like about 50%, almost exactly 50%, are currently required.
Wow.
And then about 25% is our biggest category under the don't know. So I'm going to go ahead and close. So thank you for voting. We had over almost 450 people vote. So thank you for voting. You'll have another opportunity here in a moment. I'm letting the last few get in. Okay, I'm going to close the poll, and then you'll see what those final results are. 48.9% are currently required. 26% don't know. So we'll go to the next section of our presentation. Next up is Chris Cahill. Chris is a Senior Product Marketing Manager for System Sensor. Chris, please take it away.
Okay, I'm going to begin with our low-frequency product offering and get started with that. When we started our design work for the new low-frequency devices, we first looked at our piezo element that we use on our standard devices. And the piezo element is very efficient and draws very little energy. And one of the other benefits is that it's really small and can fit in our smaller housings. Unfortunately, it's designed for optimal efficiency at 3 kilohertz. And once we tried driving a square wave through it, it couldn't meet the required harmonic profile, so we couldn't use it on the low-frequency devices. So then we looked at our traditional 4-inch speaker. Obviously, it's a lot bigger and more complicated to wire for basic applications. So we designed a custom 2-inch speaker that could fit into our horn and horn strobe and still work on 2 wires. Then we used that same speaker for our low-frequency sounder bases, and those are an offering that are going to be coming out shortly. Our 520 Hz speaker component is custom designed to resonate around 520 Hz frequency and fully comply with ANSI UL 464 requirements. It produces the maximum sound output, provides an efficient circuit design, and allows us to keep familiar product designs between our standard and low-frequency products. This way you're not looking at brand new product designs every time you go to wire something new. Our AV product line consists of a 2-wire low-frequency sounder and sounder strobe. And because they operate on just 2 wires, you can integrate them into any new or existing fire alarm or emergency communication system. They're available both in red and white. They are a wall mount design, but are dual listed for both wall and ceiling mount installations. So if you need to, you can use the rectangular product on the ceiling. They offer all of the same features as our entire SpectrAlert Advanced product line. This includes a plug-in design to minimize ground faults, a shorting spring feature that allows you to test for wiring integrity before system commissioning, and a universal mounting plate so you can mount these devices to different types of electrical back boxes. And these devices come with our system sensor synchronization protocol, so you can combine them with our traditional mini horn, horn strobe, all on the same NAC line. They're the first UL-listed 520 Hz low-frequency notification appliance on the market, and they're also FM and CSFM approved. Our 520 Hz low-frequency sounders come with 3 selectable tones, temp 3, continuous, and coded. And a coded tone is a tone that can be created by the fire alarm panel or a power supply. And just to mention, our sounder-only versions are compatible with both a 12 and 24 volt DC or full wave rectified systems. Our 520 Hz low frequency sounder strobes incorporate a xenon strobe into the devices. And the Candela range is our high Candela offering, which includes the 135, 150, 177, and 185 Candela, which is field selectable. These come with just 2 selectable tones, temp 3 and continuous, and are compatible with our 24 volt DC or full wave rectified system. And as I kind of touched on, we are coming out with a new low frequency sounder base, and we'll be releasing that shortly. Similar to our standard sounder base, we'll offer 2 models, the B200S-LF and the B200SR-LF. And the general features, detector compatibility, and the pre-wire mounting plate will be similar to the standard sounder bases. The B200S-LF can generate continuous, march time, temp 3, and temp 4 pattern. And the temp 4 is important since this is the tone you need for carbon monoxide applications. We have high and low volume are selectable. And another important feature is that they can synchronize with other system sensor AV devices. The B200SR-LF, it has a few less bells and whistles but can still meet all of the low frequency requirements and use the same type of pre-wire mounting plate for easier installation. And moving on to a different topic, we tried to make a lot of our low frequency devices look and function very much the same, so it makes it easier for you to install. But they are a little bit different on the inside, so we want to go through a few of the things to think about when you're designing these systems. Okay, to begin with, the requirements were added only to sleeping spaces, and the requirements for Chapter 18 as well as Chapter 29. The Chapter 18 requires low-frequency devices in every sleeping space for a protected premise fire alarm system, and Chapter 29 only requires them in sleeping spaces for those classified as having mild to severe hearing loss for household fire alarm systems. So before this change went into effect, most installers were using mini horns or horns only as their notification appliance solution for the sleeping spaces or possibly a sounder base. And as I mentioned before, those products utilize a piezo element that draws very little energy and is relatively inexpensive. With the new low frequency requirement, at least for our product solution, we found the best way to meet the requirement was to utilize the speaker element. And in speakers inherently draw more energy, compounded with the fact that a square wave signal format is required that also requires more energy, these low frequency products draw significantly more current than a standard product. This will impact the amount of power supplies you will need to meet the sleeping space requirements. And since we utilize a speaker to meet this requirement, the product also costs more than our traditional horn products. So by nature, more current draw and a more expensive device. So this is something you want to keep in mind when you're planning your systems and laying them out. Using a low-frequency sounder base in each room that is connected to the fire alarm panel's notification appliance can give general evacuation notice. And in most sleeping spaces, especially in an R1, R2 occupancy, installers and designers like to provide local notification before general notification, especially if someone can be careless and they're burning popcorn and you don't want to evacuate the whole building because of that. So for many people in the industry, there was not always the right product released, or we're just releasing the products that you want to use. So one option is to use a control module interconnected with our notification appliances to provide both the local and general occupant notification. So this can add up to a lot of control modules if you want to do this for every sleeping room. So what we were recommending is that if you tie a grouping of rooms together to a control module to make it more economical. The amount of devices you can connect to the control module is dependent, of course, on the current draw of the product you use. Or now that we will be launching the new sounder base, this can also be done directly with the low-frequency sounder base. The next requirement, effective January 1st, 2015, ties low frequency and carbon monoxide together. So not only will you have to require to do the temp 3 in a low frequency tone, but also you'll need to have a temp 4 device in the room. This is why it is important that the B200S-LF offers a temp 4 tone. Not all devices do this, so make sure you have the pattern you need for your application. And taking this one step further, combining a couple of features, the temp 4 general and local evac. If you use the B200S-LF sounder base, which offers the temp 4, you can set that for a local CO event at low volume. Then if a pull station is activated for a fire event, the temp 3 would take precedence for general evac at high volume. And another application, if you're doing a high-rise hotel space, the requirement is that protected premise fire alarm systems require voice systems for the sleeping spaces. And then the question comes up, can you use a voice system to comply with the low frequency requirement? And the answer is yes, you can use a voice system to comply with the low frequency requirement, but it requires system compatibility, meaning the panel, the amplifier, the low frequency signal, and the manufacturer speakers you want to use have to comply with the low frequency requirement as defined per section 24.3 of ANSI UL 464, as well as audibility requirements. So system compatibility is required because speakers are passive devices, meaning they're just turning on and off, and they're relying on the signal that is generated either by the amplifier or by a program that is fed into the amplifier and then distributed down to the speaker. Passing through all of those components can impact the output of the signal as it comes out of the speakers. And sometimes this requirement can be confusing because a data sheet might read that it's rated from 400 to 4,000 hertz, and you think, okay, it's 520 hertz, so it falls in the range, and that should be okay. But what the low frequency requirement is also telling you is it has to be a square wave tone, so you need to have both. And when UL evaluates the amplifiers to ANSI UL 1711, they only evaluate them across an average of their listed frequency range. So for example, if you have an amplifier that is an average across the range or is listed from 600 to 2,000 hertz, all of that testing was performed as the average. And they're not just testing any specific range of the frequency within that range. Not sure if I said that clearly. So to determine if your system compatibility has been achieved, you need to check with the amplifier or the panel manufacturer. Now, in the interim, until compatibility is established, what you may be required to do is to utilize a low-frequency sounder to meet the low-frequency requirement and utilize the speaker for the voice message. Special timing may be required to allow the low-frequency notification appliance to awaken the occupants before you go into your voice message. Once compatibility has been established, the requirement will be to play the low-frequency alarm signal through the speaker for 3 to 10 seconds before the voice message is played. This sequence should be repeated for a minimum of 3 times. In many Group R1 applications, you will see a smoke alarm which may be connected to the protected premise fire alarm system, but is not allowed to generate a building-wide evacuation. The smoke alarm needs to comply with the low-frequency requirements, or you can use a separate notification appliance that can comply with the requirement. And as of today, I'm not aware of a manufacturer that has an ANSI UL 217 low-frequency smoke alarm in the market. This is probably uncommon, but you could have a situation where in sleeping space you have a smoke alarm with a non-low frequency alarm tone, and you have a low-frequency notification appliance in the sleeping space going off at the same time, and this is allowed. In accordance with 29.3.9 smoke alarm and household fire alarm system notification signals are not required to be synchronized. The requirements are only for sleeping spaces and not intended throughout the building. When people are awake and moving about in the business about their business, the standard 3 kilohertz product is a very effective way of alerting people, so they don't really need the low frequency in those places. One question we do get asked, is there a requirement that the tone be the same throughout the building? And their answer is no. So you could have the 3 kilohertz in one part and the low frequency in another. NFPA 72 does allow the difference of tones as long as tones within the notification zone are synchronized. The only requirement is that you preserve the temporal pattern. Okay, David, back to you for another survey question.
All right, Chris, thank you very much. So we do have our next poll question. So I'm going to put that up on the slide for you here. You've now seen the sounder and sounder strobe, and Chris has gone through the sounder base. Maybe there's a voice compatibility solution out there. So which low-frequency solution do you think you'll use most frequently? You could just pick one of those. And if you do happen to pick other, use the chat option and tell us what other means to you. So Chris and Rebecca, we do have, wow, we've got a lot of questions that have been posted offline here, and I know Rebecca's answering a lot of those as Chris was speaking. Rebecca, maybe one for you, so if you can come back off mute. Will you be required, or will we be required, to verify the 520 hertz square wave tone during the inspection process?
Hi, David. No. In essence, the product listing is doing that for you. So that's why you go through UL. That's why UL has these performance requirements. So they're in essence evaluating the products to make sure that they're meeting that square wave format and that it's meeting that harmonic profile centered around 520. So all you still need to do, and something that someone had asked me previously, is that there is still the audibility requirements for the sleeping spaces, so 75 dB at the pillow. So you still have to do that and prove that out, but you don't have to do any sort of verification of that low frequency format.
Okay, all right. Next question here. Let's take a couple because we do have a couple posted. Are low frequency sounders also required in the hallways of sleeping areas?
No, I believe Chris just covered that. They're not required, but it doesn't mean you can't use them in that area. They're only intended in the sleeping spaces, but there is always that discussion or that question about, well, what do you define as that sleeping space? So if someone wants to take to extreme that, oh, you know, I might have a hotel, someone might pass out in the hallway, I guess you could do that. But there's nothing that says that you can't do that either. So the low frequency tone is effective for sleeping individuals, but it's even just as effective for people that are awake. The only issue is obviously that these devices do draw more current and they do cost more money. So it may not be the best idea in terms of cost of the system.
Okay. I've gone ahead and closed the poll here, and we'll get back to our presentation in just a moment. But it looks like when they had to pick, the sounder and strobe was picked by almost 40%, followed by the sounder base, and then the sounder. And then those that put other, there's actually one guy who asked a question about if there's an audio file available for audio systems to broadcast the low frequency tone. Are we aware of any audio file available for audio systems?
So one of the things that Chris mentioned was the voice compatibility. So you're going to have to check with either your amplifier manufacturer, whoever you use the most. There are some that I am aware of. Firelight has a solution, Silent Night has a solution, and so does Gamewell FCI. I do know that Notifier is working on one presently, but I don't know of anyone else really that has a voice solution.
Okay, all right. So we'll get back to our presentation. There are a lot of questions, so we'll handle a lot of those at the end as well. And Chris, I believe it's back to you.
Okay, I will cover some key applications that are impacted in reference to the IBC and IFC. Basically, some of the applications and where you're going to expect to see this are college university dorms, transient lodging spaces such as hotels and motels, assisted living facilities where they do not have trained staff on hand. In essence, the patrons are responsible and capable of evacuating the building. in case of emergency. Apartments and condominiums that may have a protected premise fire alarm or household fire alarm system. And both the International Fire Code and International Building Code require a low-frequency signal in certain Group R occupancies. Looking at Section 907.2, it requires a fire alarm system in new buildings. Remember that the basic purpose of a fire alarm system is to alert all occupants in the building. In accordance with NFPA 72, they must provide occupant notification in both common and tenant spaces. As an example, common spaces like corridors, lobbies, or meeting rooms within hotels. Tenant spaces can be apartment rooms, college, university, dorm rooms. And it's important to note that both the requirements in NFPA 72 and 907.2 do not apply retroactively to existing systems. But there are, of course, situations where, depending on the level of changes to the building, an AHJ may require that the building be brought up to the latest codes. So if you are working on an existing system, it is important to consult with your local AHJ and to make sure you understand which requirements will be imposed. We keep saying it's always at the AHJ's discretion. And the 2010 edition of NFPA 72 is referenced indirectly in Chapter 80 of the 2012 International Fire Code and Chapter 35 of the 2012 International Building Code. Section 18.4.5.3 in NFPA 72 requires a low-frequency audible notifications appliance in all occupancies having a protected premise fire alarm system to alert sleeping individuals. That means if you're in a state or region that follows the 2012 edition of the IBC and IFC, any sleeping space design that you may be working on or may be required to comply with low frequency requirements. And for the 2009, it's these are the NFPA 720 are referenced in Chapter 80 and Chapter 35. So let's go over the certain Group R occupancies that are impacted by the low frequency requirements. Group R1 low frequency requirement will be required in all sleeping spaces of hotels and motels that have a protected premise fire alarm system to activate the occupant notification system. There are some exceptions. Exception 1-907.2.8.1. Everybody can, I'm sure, remember all the numbers. Exempts a protected premise fire alarm system if the building is less than 2 stories or where individual sleeping units have direct exits to an open area from the rooms. And the low frequency signal is also required in sleeping units Group R-2 geared toward college and university dormitories, where there is a protected premise fire alarm system intended to notify all occupants, including the sleeping spaces. And the International Code Council has a really nice website that keeps up-to-date records of what states and regions are under which edition of several international codes. And I know several people said they weren't sure whether they needed to follow low frequency requirements, so this could be helpful for you to take a look at. So if you go to iccsafe.org and go to the Government Relations section, it will direct you to several links that refer to the 2012 state adoptions. And what we have done on our website is that we go through and we try to help just give you a general overview of states that have taken a statewide adoption, and then that's the lighter blue. And the darker blue areas are local or county-wide adoptions of where people have already changed over to low frequency requirements. And it is growing relatively quickly across the U.S. And what this next map is showing is, in addition, these are states that also have commercial CO requirements. So when you're looking for devices and you're also saying, okay, now I also need that Temp4 requirement in there, you need to find a low frequency with a Temp4 type device in that system. And this completes our presentation, so we can move on to answering some of the questions that have shown up, and we did appear to have a long list, so I'll let David kind of monitor the questions.
You bet. So let's start first with how we can help you, and I'm going to leave this up for a couple minutes here. So we've covered a lot of information today. Maybe you'd like to see the low frequency data sheets that we have on product offerings, maybe a frequently asked question, so that's LF is all stands for low frequency. We've developed an applications guide for low frequency, and we also have some supporting research that was really the cause to get a lot of these products available. the adoption maps that Chris showed, or you'd like maybe to talk with one of our sales representatives. So I'm going to leave this up for a couple minutes, and then we'll take it down, but go ahead and click those responses that you'd like us to complete for you. So let's get into the questions here. There are a bunch, so those of you that have already posted questions, you're probably going to get yours answered here in the next 15 minutes or so. Let's see here. Let's go with this. Any idea if NFPA 101 will have requirements for this product in sleeping areas? NFPA 101, do we know that, or should we follow up with that individual later?
I'm going to follow up on that because I believe NFPA 101 does align with the what's required in the International Building Code and Fire Code, but let me double check that.
Okay, very good. So next question here from attendees. Will we be able to use these low-frequency devices as an option for businesses that employ hearing-impaired workers?
Well, I mean, the devices are available, so you can use them for public evacuation. It's just that the intent of the devices were obviously for the code that were for sleeping spaces. But yeah, you can use them. They meet the audibility, as long as they meet the audibility requirements that you need. Okay,
all right. If the devices are used on the ceiling, is there a separate housing to allow the word fire to be oriented correctly?
You know, at this point in time, we only have our wall mount configuration devices, so the markings will be, you know, they're not in the necessarily the right orientation. But it's my understanding that there is no marking requirements really within NFPA 72 that talks about that you have to have any marking. That seems to be more of a fire marshal enforcement and more of a historical thing that people are just used to seeing fire in certain orientation. But they are allowed and listed for both wall and ceiling mount installations.
Okay, all right. Let's see here. Boy, kind of a local question, but the AHJ for a local university requires that fire alarm sounders have no marking that says fire. Are these devices available without the word fire?
At this point in time, we only have a marked fire.
Okay, all right. And the question about speakers, do we have a product offering that has speakers that can be used for voice and low frequency?
So we've been working with our fire systems brands for a voice solution. So as I mentioned earlier, Silent Night, Firelight, and Gamewell FCI all have a voice compatibility solution approved by UL. Notifier is presently at UL. And what you have to use is our indoor high-fidelity speakers and speaker strobes. Those would be like an SPR, SPSR, SPSCR, or SPSCW. They will have the entire list of the speakers that you can use, and they will also be providing you with the specific low-frequency signal that you have to use that was approved by UL.
Okay. Rebecca, I know you answered this offline, but maybe just for the attendees' benefit, when do we plan to have the low-frequency devices as part of our volt drop calculator?
We're working on that. The voltage drop tool needs some modifications, and we're trying to add the information in there. I don't have a date, so once it's available, we'll make sure to send out an e-blast and a communicator on that.
Okay, all right, very good. They're asking for a clarification here. They write, can you clarify the comment regarding using a control module and grouping a number of rooms? In private mode operation, wouldn't the maximum number of devices be one unless the sleeping room is a suite?
So the use of the control module is if you're using just the low frequency sounder. Right now, if you were just tied to a NAC line, you'd obviously have your whole entire NAC line, and they'd all have to go off. So you'd either have to wire them for just that room or for a general evacuation. The control module allows you to do that, but to give you both the public and the local and the general evacuation. But unless you want to wire each individual room with one control module, that might be a little bit, cost sensitive. So that's why we were recommending that you might want to do a grouping of rooms. So maybe you were going to tie like 3 rooms in that floor versus, every 3 rooms versus the entire wing, because if not, you're going to be using a lot of control modules. Now, when the low-frequency sounder base comes out, that product provides you that benefit that you don't need that control module. That sounder base will give you both that local and general evacuation based on programming from the panel.
Okay. We're going to take one more question here, folks. We'll continue to take questions, actually, but I'm going to close this last how we can help you slide here. So if you do have anything we can help you with, we do have a number of people that have responded to this, but if you do, we'll take one more question and then we'll move on to the next ones here. They're wondering about combination devices that may sense smoke and CO and provide a low-frequency sounder. Anything like that in the works?
Chris, do you want to answer that?
I can answer that one. The low-frequency sounder base, the B200SR-LF, not the SR, the B200S-LF does offer Temp 4, and it is a low-frequency device, and that should be out in the near future.
Okay, all right. Also asking for the timing of the sounder bases. Do we have a hard launch date or at least a month we can tell them?
I will say January 2015 is a relatively safe date to offer. Okay. If we can be there sooner, we will be.
Good, good. Okay, so first of the year, that's good. Couple questions on current draw. How do the low-frequency AV devices compare to maybe standard devices of a similar suit? Rebecca?
So our low-frequency sounder only, if you're going to look at the comparison between like our SpectrAlert Advanced horn-only HR, the current draw is almost double. And as we have mentioned in this webinar, the reason why is because we're using a speaker, and also because of the square wave format profile. It's just so much energy that you need to generate to meet that format that the devices just draw so much more current. So it is when you're designing your NAC line, if you're used to using like a horn only or a mini horn, be aware that the current draws will be higher.
Okay. All right. And the power supply needs thus affect. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. A question on reporting and documentation. They ask, what reporting or documentation do I need to produce so I can validate this UL listing?
For the low-frequency sounders, as I mentioned before, I showed a snapshot of our listing card. So the listing of the devices is the verification that you would provide. Also, there's the marking on the housing, and on the nameplate, it'll say low-frequency appliance, something of that nature. If you're talking about a voice system, because this is a compatibility solution, you're going to have to look at the amplifier or panel manufacturer. They have a compatibility document that is controlled and governed by UL. So by having that information in that document, that means that it's been approved and listed by UL.
Very good. Let's see here. They'd like to know about the research. Their question is, has there been any research on low-frequency sound in sensitive areas? And they say they're working on like an animal storage and research facility. Anything specific to, I guess, animals in the research too?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, all the studies that were done were on people. I know that there's been some, certain things about lower frequencies are better for animals, but I think those are much lower, like 400 hertz and stuff of that nature. But all of the studies that were done on low frequency were on humans.
Okay, all right. And there's a number of questions of people who want to hear the low frequency tone. And I would encourage them to go to systemsensor.com/LF for low frequency. Look on the right-hand side of the page under related links, and there's actually a tone there you can actually hear live, so you can hear what that tone sounds like. What about sound output of a low-frequency device compared to a conventional horn?
Well, because once again you're using a speaker element and the square wave format requirements are pretty stringent, you will see as more competitors come out there, the audibility ratings aren't as high as a traditional horn. That piezo element, you can really boost that up, and most of those devices, I'm not going to speak for every manufacturer, they're kind of hopping around a number of higher frequencies. you know, anywhere between 2 kilohertz and 4 kilohertz. So you can really get a lot of sound output. Because you're focusing your energy so much on this lower frequency scale, the audibility isn't quite as high. So don't be surprised if you see for a temporal 3 around 76, 77 dB.
Okay, all right. Looking at kind of product development, they're using our dual strobes now, and there's wondering if the devices could be used in the dual strobe, or if we're working on a dual strobe for low frequency.
Our low frequency sounder only can mount on the strobe only expander plate, but we don't have well, in theory, you could use our high fidelity speaker or speaker strobe on the speaker expander plate if you're doing a low frequency voice solution. So yes, in theory, we do have a solution right now.
Okay, all right. What about proof of low frequency compliance? So how do we provide proof of low frequency compliance of a voice system?
I think I mentioned this earlier. You're going to have to check with that amplifier manufacturer to provide you with the compatibility document that was approved by UL, or they're going to have to provide you with some sort of letter or justification from UL. Okay. Because UL does not publish compatibility on the online listing directory.
Okay, very good. So thank you for all these questions. We do have a number of others that are posted here, so we'll get to as many as we can in the hour reserved for this webinar. They're asking a question about low-frequency sounder bases and being synchronized. Can low-frequency sounder bases be synchronized amongst each other?
On the they can be synchronized amongst each other, absolutely. And with the B200S-LF, they can be synchronized with system sensor AV devices as well.
Okay, all right. Let's see. Rebecca, I think this might be for you. They're looking for lower Candela ratings or options for low-frequency devices. Maybe walk through the Candela offerings and why we offered what we did.
Yeah, so right now we only have our low-frequency combo of the high Candela offering. So that's at 135, 150, 177, and 185. And the reason why we did that is because the sleeping space requirements for your light output for a wall is for a ceiling, is 177. So when we asked our customers what they wanted, they didn't want to have like a whole product line. So they said, if you just offer your high Candela offering, that's fine because I can use that on the wall or the ceiling. So that's why we did what we did. We do get a lot of requests, and I'll keep evaluating it, and if we feel that it's a necessity, we'll look into adding our standard Candela one as well. I will let you know, though, the current draw is high primarily because of that speaker, not because of the strobe. So it's really not going to save you much in terms of current draw if that's what a lot of people are asking me about.
Okay. All right, good. Question about a mini horn. Any plans to have, or do we offer a mini horn with low frequency, or any plans to offer a mini horn?
No. Now, the way we met this low frequency requirement is by creating that custom 2-inch speaker, and it's pretty big to fit in a mini horn housing design. A lot of this sound output and just the performance really does depend also on the size of the cavity of the housing, and it would be very difficult to create a mini horn low frequency solution.
Okay. Chris, I think this is related to the synchronizing together, but the question is worded a little differently. I just want to make sure we've got it covered. Is there a way to interconnect sounder bases?
The SR version uses an interconnect wire. The S version can actually be synchronized through the panels. So they are both synchronized, it's just different means. So the S has a little bit more, a nicer way to do it, a simpler way to do it.
Okay, all right, very good. Let's take just a couple more questions here in the time we have. The question about R occupancies. So are the only occupancies that need low frequency sounders R occupancies?
In terms of, yes, at this point, yes. I think you're talking about like the hospitals and all those other occupancies. As far as I understand it, the only ones that have some direct requirements for occupant notification are the group R occupancies.
Let's see. We covered a lot of these. Another question about carbon monoxide, which we've answered. We've answered about the availability, so let me just scroll through these. So, they're asking about receiving this presentation, and let me just let you all know that shortly after this webinar, you actually will receive the recording of this presentation, so you can refer to it at your leisure. And also those of you that have submitted requests for documentation as well, you'll get that shortly after. So yes, we will be sending you this. Let's see, maybe our last question here, is there a current BIM or CAD modeling available for implementing into current projects for modeling purposes? So BIM or CAD with low frequency?
We do have our CAD drawings for a low-frequency sounder and sounder strobe on the website.
Mm-hmm.
You should be able to find them if you just go under the product links.
Okay, very good. Maybe one more here. Will the low frequency, will the sounders of low frequency be required in hospitals or other healthcare patient rooms or only in sleeping quarters? So maybe two questions there. Can you mix standard notification with low frequency, and then specific to a whole hospital versus sleeping quarters?
Yeah, so you can mix them. So as long as they use the same synchronization protocol, you can intermix non-low frequency with low frequency. Now, when it comes to hospitals, those are treated a little bit differently. In most cases, you'll have like the nurse's station that's responsible for the patients, because obviously if you've got a intensive care unit where someone maybe just had a heart attack, you don't want to be giving them another heart attack when these devices go off into alarm. So there were specific comments in there about, for instance, the assisted living facilities and nursing homes. It only depends if you have trained staff on hand or not. So most cases, hospitals, you do not put them in the patient rooms.
Okay, all right. Last question I'll answer here. They're asking about their CEU certification. That should be to you in a couple hours using the same email address that you used to register. So we will be fulfilling that if you did attend today's webinar. So on behalf of System Sensor, I want to thank our presenters, Rebecca and Chris. Also want to thank you for joining us today. As a follow-up, we will send you a brief survey and would appreciate your help in filling that out. Again, thank you for joining us. This does conclude the webinar. Please have a nice rest of the day.